You can go, but you got to come back and serve another 2 years when you get out, because you owe us 2 more years. So I fretted a lot about that, although I'd been to Vietnam earlier. And that's the reason I was assured myself that I would go back to Vietnam after I graduated at Leavenworth. So I got caught up at Leavenworth on things tactical, I thought. And I was ready to go back and command a battalion in combat, although the Milverson guys didn't want to do that.
To go back to the 457th.
4 nickel natural.
I'm continually perplexed about the, I want to know what went on in the battery day to day when you first got there, and there were 11 lieutenants, and you had all these trainees, and the captain didn't even come in till 9 o'clock, and all of the lieutenants were graduates of the class of 53 somewhere, and so none of you had as much as a year of service at the outset, and who structured things? What did you do? Were there a bunch of committees or something, or training, or did each lieutenant take a certain?
Well, we had an ATP. We had an ATP Army Training Program, which is sort of a given, and we were following that with the trainees, and that was set up by battalion and run by battalion. We were told to go out and do X amount of survey and Y amount of shooting, Z amount of RSOPing, and so those things were fairly structured routines. What was not spent a lot of time on, at least initially, was then turning that unit into what I would call a high-performing shooting unit at that juncture. Later, that comes in because we keep a lot of these guys and we stabilize it with some NCOs. When we get ready to go to Europe, it becomes the training focus changes from, see if I can put this in the right context. Training focus changes when we go to Europe from being a stateside unit with no particular mission. Just be a unit.
Just be a unit.
Pass an annual IG. Pass an annual training test, both at the battery and the battalion level. Go to this myriad of schools that General Wayne Smith had put up to occupy our time.
Right. Well, of course, that sort of screwed things up, because from a training management point of view,
A lot of people were gone.
Yes.
At school. But
And
those
in and out,
things,
yeah.
but those things were in fact oriented in terms of military skills. I mean,
Right.
you can't denigrate the schools that he asked us to go to because they had military relevance. But it's surely interrupted the continuum of training people to go do a particular mission. Well, now, when you don't have any mission except pass the ATT or pass the IG, it's quite different than what our perspective is today, where you have a mission essential task list, or if you go to Germany, you're oriented on the Soviet menace that may be there, or in the case of even the 82nd, which we find today has got a string that you can deploy a battalion on 18 hours notice or whatever. So those things are so different in what we know now than what we were doing in the mid-50s. The mid-50s was the period in which you were recovering from the war in Korea in a peacetime army that had no particular aim other than the ability to carry out those IG inspections and the training of recruits if you happen to get those. There wasn't any real NCO school at that time for people, although there was a non-commissioned officer school on post, but it wasn't codified like it is today. And so there was a lot of busy work going on. So who did the busy work? We all did that. The captain, the battery commander, who was there the first go-around for a short period of time, shot his rifle, shot his pistol every morning, came to duty. He discussed what was going to go on with the first sergeant. First sergeant got with the training lieutenant. One of the guys, wasn't me, was the training officer, and they'd publish a schedule for a week, and that was sort of,
It
it was a pretty
assigned.
relaxed operation.
It assigned you to take your survey team?
Take my survey team, go out and practice survey, and I'd go do that, and maybe once a month we'd go to the field with a battery and do it in the field.
But then you go off to school, and you go off to school again, and then you go off to...
Yeah, that interrupted all of it.
And so who would look after the survey?
Survey squad team, well, I had a survey sergeant, he looked
Sergeant.
after while I was gone. Planes.
I was wondering about that. Did you jump
Make
the
a lot of
cannon?
jumps.
The cannon and the trucks and the radios and all that?
Oh, yeah, and we'd, but not as many heavy drops as parachute jump. We do a lot of parachute jumping. The notion in those days, you want to try to get everybody to do one a month grant, parachute jump. Rarely were they done at night. From an equipment standpoint, the mass of the jumps was done only with rifles, occasionally a general purpose bag. I'm contrasting that to my time in the 82nd as a diverting commander there, when most of the jumps were at night. All of them were equipment jump, had some tactical problem at the end of it. Most of our jumps were not tactically oriented. They were what you call a pay jump.
Could you jump the 105 howitzers?
Yeah, you could parachute those, heavy drop. But not, we didn't do that extensively.
Was it frequent damage when you do that?
I don't recall us having, occasionally you'd have a major malfunction where you'd have a major damage to the howitzer, but I don't recall that as being, it was an event when one of those occurred. I mean, it's a major event when one ordered in.
Well, it was an event to drop the 105 even.
One, it was an event, and two, it was uncommon to have one order in. It's also uncommon to go out and parachute jump. Maybe once a quarter, maybe we'd have a heavy drop, as I recall it.
They used to jump. They jumped with 75 howitzers, pack howitzers in Europe.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether the jump in Korea used those.
Yeah, the parachute jumps in Korea were with 75s.
So I guess it was bigger airplanes were available.
Yep.
Well, that I can see how that would work. I would think that it would require a battery commander keeping his finger very much on orchestrating his personnel who would lead training.
This guy was a very nice guy. There wasn't heavy focus on field performance. He was replaced later by a guy who, this was his, whether Lieutenant Fusel had a battery in Korea, I don't recall, but Stan was a very much more tightly managed commander. The other guy had been a World War II veteran, so he was comfortable by spending half the day out shooting. The reins of control got tighter in the battery as the battery commander changed, and as we flunked the battalion test.
Who took you through the battery test? The captain or the Lieutenant Fusel?
Lieutenant Fusel. And we did all right on the battery
There was
test.
no sweat.
No.
Was that about a one-day operation or two-day operation?
As I recall it, it was a period of a 24-hour operation, because you had to do some night shooting.
I begin to get the picture of how it might have been. You mentioned that you had a very long training day starting about 5 o'clock in the morning, but then the troops were off early in the
Well,
afternoon, and then...
General Smith thought it would be nice because of the heat,
Right.
the oppressive heat.
But the lieutenants had to stay on duty, but it wasn't appropriate
Lieutenants
for
had to get there
5 o'clock.
early, had to get there before reveille, you know, and then lieutenants had to stick around in the afternoon
What'd you
and
do?
get ready
Report
for
to
tomorrow and
survey
all that kind of stuff. So it became a very long duty day for lieutenants, battery officers. But for the troops, it worked out fine on the grounds that they only worked from 5:30 in the morning till 1:30 in the afternoon. You say, well, what did they do the rest of the time? And the answer is they goofed off, tended their personal business, had an enormous number of car wrecks on the highway between Fort Campbell, Kentucky and Nashville, Tennessee. Head-on collisions and that kind of stuff. So you sort of look back on that. It wasn't the James Jones book of Schofield Barracks and all that, but it was the tempo of life was certainly nothing like what we would find in Germany when we got there, nor was it the tempo of life that I would come to know in the 82nd Airborne Division later when I reported there as a Authority Commander.
With slower tempo?
Or slower.
Slower. Well, in the afternoons, usually a battery doesn't have a bunch, it's not like an office building.
No, as a matter of fact.
Where did you
the
guys
orderly
work?
The orderly room, well, you worked in the day room.
I see.
The orderly room is only big enough for the first sergeant and the battery commander. And the exec had a desk, as I recall it, and the rest of us were operating out of our hip pocket and spent time in the day room if we were trying to do something constructive. So it became and we had a battalion classroom in the area that if you had to go prepare something or teach a class or whatever it is, go down there and get your gear organized for the class function. But it was a constrained area. It was all wooden buildings, and that's one reason that Smith had wanted to get the day over with, because the buildings were hotter than firecrackers. They were wooden construction left over from temporary buildings of World War II, with very little amenities in it.
I was trying to get a grip on with the junior officers who were new and a battery commander who was only partly there, and a kind of a mixture of very qualified and quickly qualified wartime NCOs, where the officers and NCOs who did the teaching for these AIT troops, where they learned it, and I guess that's when you learned it, was from each other and from manuals in the afternoon.
Yeah, I think that, I recall General Depew later in life. I'd worked for him, and one of the things he always said was, you got to get doctrine written and put up on a shelf, because captains and lieutenants, when they're told to do something, go and get the manual and read it and perform it. I recall, going to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, getting a gunnery sack full of manuals. And so if you had to teach anything about gunnery, it was all in the manuals. If you had to teach anything about care and maintenance of the house, it's all in the manuals. If you had to teach anything about reconnaissance and survey, it's all in the manuals. So doing that stuff is available and didn't have to be made up or manufactured. What you had to do was get your training program lined up, do the research, prepare the class, and go out and practice it, teach the theory of it, and then go out and practice it on the ground. And so doing reconnaissance and survey work, in my book, was a piece of cake, because all the reference manuals were perfectly appropriate for doing that. So all you had to do is go out and do stick, stuck, and pull tape, and get your, in that case it was aiming circle work, and had smart kids. Had a guy, my computer, as I recall, it was a 2-year college guy, and in mathematics, and so he knew how to run numbers as a piece of cake. Now, he didn't have any computers. It was all done on forms and calculations and looking up cosine factors and all that kind of stuff, you know. So, but the talent was there, and I guess what I would say to you is that the division had a large number of things you had to do. You had to do a 25-mile march. The division had to do a 25-mile march every month. Well, when you think about that, I'm talking about everybody. Art Thurman, everybody else had to go do the 25-mile march. That's 2 days on your train schedule.
Yeah.
Getting ready, going and doing it, recovering, letting people's feet soak out, you know, the next day or whatever. That's 2 days gone. Okay, if you're going to do a parachute jump once a month, yeah, that's 2 days gone. Well, if you look at 20 days in a month, pretty soon you're eating up
You're eating
time,
all up,
you know.
yeah.
And so the unit had perfectly good people in it. And it was not until we got we flunked the battalion test and got a new battalion commander who knew field artillery, cold turkey. And he then knuckled us down for a couple of weeks and went out and blew the hell out of the test, scored a very high score on it. And shows you that the quality of people that were in the organization there, and I've recounted some people who made general out of that organization, was excellent.
Yeah,
It got to its peak performance in Germany, where there became sort of what I'd call a definable mission. And those were the heydays of the famous usurer commander whose admonition was, an organization does well on those things, the boss checks. And Bruce Clark is the 7th Army commander and usurer commander. And operations in the field were stressed over there, and so the unit was immediately able to adapt itself to go do that. So if you look back on it and say, well, suppose you had to take that unit into combat. If you'd taken that unit into combat, you had a coterie of non-commissioned officers who had served in combat in Korea. And all of the field grade officers had served in combat in Korea. So going to combat, I think, would have been a piece of cake. I mean, we might have sifted out a couple of battalion commanders or S3s or whatever, but the raw material was available in division artillery to go straighten that out fast.
This was in Germany.
No, I was going to say at Fort Campbell.
Oh, you've been at Fort Campbell.
Fort Campbell, although we didn't spend an enormous amount of time in artillery matters in the field, because there was no discernible mission at that time except past the ATTs. Looking at the group of people, men that there were in the unit at the time, an NCO nucleus that had been to combat in Korea, an officer at the field grade officer level who'd been to combat in Korea. Could the unit have gone to combat and distinguished itself? I think yes, because we had a terrific coterie of lieutenants. And those people that, and what happens over time is that group has been extraordinarily tight over a long period of service. I mean, 35 years of service, these people are still friends because they spent 5 years in this unit together. But the competency that was in the unit was latent competency because there was nothing to demonstrate it on sort of in a mission-related job. And as soon as you got to Germany, on switch went on, because now you had sort of a definable mission. You had to go up and do the GDP walks. You had to go to Grafenwehr and shoot bullets and go to Hohenfels and do all that kind of stuff. Piece of cake.
Yes, that sounds like the case. And it's funny, it reminds me a little bit of what was going on in Vietnam, where there was a disjuncture between the older people and the people who were doing obligated service, either as privates or lieutenants, and the younger ones, the draftees and the lieutenants, seemed to be very, very good, but frequently there were field grade officers who had not had not plied their trade as artillerymen or infantrymen for a long time.
In our case, the field grade at the battalion level had earned its wings in Korea, shooting bullets. Going back and looking, there were two classes of people in the division artillery at that time. This is Fort Campbell. There was a group of men who had served in World War II in Korea and were professional artillery officers who were never going to advance to high rank. I think all wars produce that group of people. There was a sprinkling of principally captains who were in the division artillery, who would go on to be lieutenant general rank. Two of the guys in the division at the time come to mind easily are Charlie Hall, who was a West Point graduate of 46, a fellow named Gordon Sumner, who was an OCS graduate, and he'd become lieutenant general. There were a great number of lieutenants, a substantial number of lieutenants who would go on and become generals in the Army.
But your initial battalion commander was relieved, though he had commanded a battalion in combat. Your executive officer you described as essentially a non-entity, and the S3 couldn't function as an S3. Had he functioned as an S3 in combat?
No, not to my knowledge.
That's a sort of a third group of guys who...
Third group of guys were people who had gone to Korea, and because of what I'd call the stalemate conditions in Korea, had stayed on, and because you could stay in Korea and get promoted. As I recall, the rule in those days was if you'd been in the job for 30 days, you could get promoted, like from lieutenant to captain. Second lieutenant to first lieutenant to captain in those days, because it was decentralized promotion boards in those times, or not boards, but decentralized promotion. And there was a lot of field promotion about that time. Getting promoted, beyond that, of course, there was a DA controlled operation. But part of that was this rule base that said, it's the rule base that I learned more about in Vietnam, which I didn't understand as a lieutenant, because it wasn't applicable when I came out, because I wasn't in Korea. But it had to do with the business of going and serving a 12 or 13-month tour, trying to attract people to stay on the combat tour, stay longer through promotion opportunity. Because that meant you didn't have to draft as many people and cycle as many people into Korea from the United States. So personnelists were out there doing maybe one of those things you're going to have to research or whatever, the personnel policy associated with Korea. But I think that there were incentives both in the NCO Corps and the Junior Officer Corps to have people stay on. Well, this gave you then a coterie of people that were OCS grads or Mustangs up from the ranks in World War II who had stayed on and got an opportunity to go back to Korea, make some rank, etc., who could do the day-to-day combat chores, but weren't very good leaders when you came back to a garrison community and had to go do your thing as we did in our garrison community. So we had sort of as you say, a tri-legged officer corps, a tri-legged stool there which had some really top-notch people who would go and be very high-ranking people and very distinguished artillery officers. We had a group of people who were going to leave the Army as lieutenant colonels after 20 years, 22 or 3 years, and never amounted to much after that. And then we had some really duds.
Yeah, I'm trying to chase the duds. there don't seem to be many of those around now. And,
Well, obviously not now. I mean,
well, of course, there've been a lot of pruning.
you're talking about in our Army today?
In our Army today, and in our Army before the big cutback came, the Army of...
No, I think we got better at winnowing young people out. If you go back and look at sort of personnel policy beginning in after the rifts in the 70s, in other words, you look at that time, getting rid of the hump in Vietnam.
It was a real bloodbath then.
You really got rid of a lot of people. And so then you said you had to meet gates of service with troops and that kind of stuff. So you began to put down strictures that caused young people who weren't with the troops or served poorly when they were with the troops to get passed over. And thus, I think the professionalism of the officer corps took a gigantic wrench up after the mid to late 70s when we got rid of the Vietnam group of officers that had come out of perhaps OCS or West Point or whatever. I think you got rid of two kinds of people in the 70s. One, you got rid of a group of distinguished officers who simply couldn't suffer the Army anymore because of what they saw as loss of values, a loss of competence, a loss of confidence in seniors, and you lost some damn fine officers. But then you lost officers who had gone to OCS, probably weren't really competent to be platoon leaders, and we saw the ill effects of that, maybe in My Lai and places like that.
Yes.
Were rapidly advanced because we were rapidly advancing officers over to turn them around to go back for the second tour, and really weren't going to make it in the long run. So I think you got winded severely in the 70s, which left you with a nucleus of very competent people as we went in the 80s. We had the rejuvenation of the Army that took off in the 80s, and those that could keep up prospered. Those that weren't able to manage it were selected out through Passover.
You never mentioned your first sergeant in the Charlie in the 457th.
I can't even recall his name.
See,
Leroy Browning.
he was your sergeant major.
Sergeant Major.
You said he took care. He said he'd take care of you for 30 days.
Right.
What did that amount to? Did he do anything, or would that just make you feel good?
No, he'd come down. Browning was a terrific guy, and maybe he so overshadowed the first sergeant. I can't even recall the first sergeant's name. He so overshadowed the Harrington, by the way, was the first sergeant in the rocket unit.
Honest John.
So I mean, I know the two guys that counted.
Yeah.
Browning was a short, wiry, quiet-speaking, authoritative battalion sergeant major. He ran, for example, the courts and boards game in the battalion. He was the guy that if you got stuck with a report of survey that you had to go do, you better go see Leroy before you got started, otherwise he'd turn that sumbitch back on you in a heartbeat because you hadn't done it right. So he knew the administration of a battalion probably as well as any sergeant major of a battalion I've ever seen. That came easy to him. So Leroy, when he'd come down and see you in a motor pool or come down and see you in a barracks area or whatever it is, he'd sort of tip you off as to what you were doing right or what you did wrong. It was a mentoring process for him that I look back on, and again, I'd just say to you that in the main, mentoring that goes on now versus what went on in those days, just totally different kind of whole process about mentoring from Stan Fusel, who's a friend of mine, wasn't what we would expect a battery commander to provide to a young officer now. It's totally different. It was a survival ordeal of those days. And I don't mean there was any animosity about that. I'm just saying the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we try to ingrain into people now with our battery commanders and the like. And the fact that we insist on battery commanders now being captains, which gives you an experiential base. In the main, most of our battery commanders are graduates of the advanced course. And so we've applied a discipline to ourselves, which would be called train, a training period followed by a practicum, followed by an assessment, which then would assert whether or not you were going to get additional command experience. So you're right, I didn't call it first service, because I couldn't tell you who it was.
Did Sergeant Major Browning's interest in you continue beyond 30 days? I mean, would he be coming down and talking to you from time to time?
Yeah, but you know, he was sort of saying, I'll tell you if I detect something wrong with you, I'll tell you to make sure you don't get caught short here.
That's very helpful.
So it's sort of a looking after you proposition the first 30 days. But Browning was not hesitant to tell you anything, anytime. He's a very gutsy, he was a very gutsy sergeant major who knew what was right and wrong and did his very best to turn the battalion into something that it wasn't with that battalion. That figure battalion commander turned out later that when he got the right battalion commander, he was further thriving on work there.
Did the XO get changed anywhere along the line, do you remember?
Only when we went to Europe, as I recall.
So
I left the battalion after about a year and went up to the DeVarty staff. So,
so that was
Battalion XO name is floating around in my head, but I don't recall his name right now. Battalion commander was there and then departed.
Did he leave the DeVarty altogether?
Huh?
Did he leave the DeVarty altogether, or did he get?
Yeah, I think he went up to the division.
And you mentioned that there were two groups of NCOs. One group that was superlatively well qualified, sort of pre-Korea people, and then others who hung around in Korea and got promoted rapidly there. And they were good in combat, but had a lot to learn about the Army as a whole. Was there a winnowing process, reductions, firings, and so forth, or development, or both going on at once? And if so, who did it? Who kind of kept these guys, who checked up on the NCOs? Because obviously lieutenants didn't know that much. That's why I was wondering about the first sergeant, because you'd already told me about the battery commanders. One was scrambling, the other was preoccupied with other things.
There were a group of sergeants, the group of sergeants that I would call extremely well qualified, who later would stay with the unit, go to Germany with the unit, and the like. I'd say that group, again, there was no really organized development work as we know it today with an NCOES operation.
No, I know there wasn't that.
And so the care and feeding of those guys was done by the battalion sergeant major, the first sergeants were looking after that. But the development program was non-existent. I mean, it was more a, you're the reconnaissance and survey non-commissioned officer, or you're the fire direction non-commissioned officer,
Go read
or
the
you're the
manual.
chief of firing battery or whatever, go do the job. And then if you don't do it well, then there might be a reduction, but most of the reductions that I recall were ones in less of an incompetence and more of a, if you had some malfeasance of off-post or on-post activity about it. The NCOs in that first battery are relatively a blur to me. You know, you often hear about people being taken under wing by their first sergeant or their platoon sergeant, whatever. I believe that this mishmash of training that we did, and us being gone half the time in these schools, or part-time in these schools, and not being focused on field training exclusively, sort of gave you a less than the average guy would remember his first unit assignment, with some notable exceptions that I've indicated. When I get to the DeVarty staff, and when I get into the Honest John business, then there becomes some very distinguished non-commissioned sergeant officers who are carrying a tremendous amount of freight and are go to Germany with us. And that group becomes a very tight shut group because it is gone from Campbell into the getting ready to go overseas, goes overseas, takes over all this gear, takes it to the field, becomes very much oriented on field duty. And so I'd say to you that in the main, the lieutenants were an aggressive bunch of lieutenants, all of whom were well educated, either ROTC or West Pointers, and who knew their business. Had to learn it as lieutenants, but knew their business, and they were essentially running the batteries in those days. Several of the lieutenants got a chance to be battery commanders, but not many. So you ask, who was taking care of the duds? The duds showed themselves up because they were either screwing around or getting drunk or not doing a very good job in accountability of property or whatever it may be, and less a problem in field duty. You follow me? In other words,
Right. Yeah.
the measurements were more measurements associated with administrative malfeasance than field or technical malfeasance. And you see, the people that had come from Korea that had advanced rapidly over there were okay on
The field stuff.
field work and not so good on administrative garrison-like activities about that. And so they were found out about that and found wanting. And so you lost NCOs through that group, or they got reduced in rank.
Did you by any chance keep copies of unit orders pertaining to you, or officer efficiency reports, anything like that?
Probably.
Do you have files of those?
Probably.
Would you let me make copies?
Yeah, if I can find them.
Okay.
They're in my house somewhere in my unpacked books, but I'll look around for them, so unpacked boxes.
I was, in connection with this business about people making mistakes on administrative things and so forth, I was wondering, and I guess probably you've answered it, I was wondering what it was that people worried about most. What was, where was the heat coming from on high? You mentioned that there wasn't much field activity except to pass the ATTs, but there must have been enormous heat when the battalion failed an ATT.
Oh, yeah. Well, the heat came from a very aggressive division commander and a very aggressive division staff on matters today that would be considered painting rocks, if I could use that cliche. Wayne Smith had a SOP out for everything. One of the SOPs had to do with, you remember in those days helicopters were a novelty. Right. But the division commander had one. And there was an SOP out on how officers or non-commissioned officers, the senior officer president would report to the arriving commanding general in his helicopter. And so if he swirled into your area in his helicopter, you were expected to go out and report with the day's training schedule and how many people were training, where all the absentees were, because he had concocted this training schedule program so that you worked from 5:30 in the morning till 1:30 in the afternoon, so everybody should be there.
Nobody on dental appointments or getting a
Guys,
haircut or
nobody
going to
getting
the
a hair-
jab.
Nobody on dental, but nobody at the hospital, all that stuff. Better not be at the bank. And so you better have a roster that had ours. So you see, everything was misconstrued or tilted toward administrative accountability functions as opposed to training content.
Yeah, right. You didn't care what you were doing as long as everybody was there.
Well, I guess he cared, but I mean, the emphasis was so much on the other that you lost sight of the, obviously you were trying to train and do right because you wanted to shoot bullets right and pass the battery and battalion test and all that, but his focus was on this administrative falderall. The Saturday, or correction, the payday activity was a division parade. And so what you did on payday was you had a division parade. Every jack among us was out for the division parade, and the last battalion that passed in review was the straggler battalion, which meant his MPs rushed around the post during the division parade, rousted up all anybody who was in Cook's Whites or any of that, on crutches or wherever the hell it was. They were policed up by the MPs and thrown into this straggler battalion.
It's an ad hoc battalion.
Yeah, at the last battalion that passed in review, that meant they had to stand out there the longest, march the furthest, and then you had your full field pack on, and you went back to the battery area, and you laid out your gear in a full field inspection. And then after that, you got paid. But geez, it didn't take me long to figure out that the job for payday was to be the pay officer.
Pay officer, right.
Because you didn't have to put up with that bullshit. So you go get your money at the finance, and then you'd go back and count out the money. And of course, those were the days that everybody said, if you don't pay the troops face to face, then obviously you don't command them. and the troops won't have respect for you, and they will disobey your orders. I mean, you heard all that folderol that came down later when you try to get a check to the bank. Everybody said, no, we can't pay. We have to pay troops, because otherwise the troops won't know who the boss is. Well, that's absolutely poppycock. But in those days, it was pay them across the pay table, and, you know, you went down to, I went down to get the money, and you had a couple of guys as your armed guards, and the lessons of all that come back later in my life to tell me some things I ought to be doing as a DeVarty commander. But the application of his ideas got twisted. Picking up paper on the range, you had a range police operations. They had sent people out on the range on a routine basis, and he would fly into a place where he'd find paper. He'd see it from a helicopter, and he'd police up pieces of paper. And I recall him coming in one day. We had a division, always had a division commanders meeting once a week with the ADC and the division artillery commander and the principal staff officers. And I was the aide at that time, and I recall him handing his wad, took a whole bag of paper and turned it over in front of the DeVarty commander. Here was a guy that was had been a brigadier general for 4 or 5 years, and humiliated him with this wad of shit that he policed up on the range.
It was in his zone of
It was
responsibility.
in his own responsibility. Had some DeVarty markings on it, where, you know, it was a schoolboyish approach to the command of the division. And so the respect and admiration for this guy was not high. Fortuitously, he did not go to Germany with us. He went on to a different posting, and we got a different commander, and he came in and did not so well either. But I mean, you sort of look back in those days and said, how did this coterie of young officers, sort of the part